This video is going to be talking about the AJAX abstraction tier used to communicate with your API server, which is useful for simplifying API server calls. So the majority of code in React Redux applications goes into action creators, reducers, and components. And this section is about the action creators. One of the main responsibilities for action creators is making AJAX calls to the API server, listening for the response, and then dispatching actions that the reducers can pick up so that the application will update. So if you want to reduce the amount of code in your action creators, a good place to start is by looking into simplifying your server calls. In a previous video, we talked about how, with respect to lore, if you want to interact with an endpoint, you simply need to create an empty model, and the framework will automatically supply a set of actions and reducers that support standard CRUD operations. And the way that the framework does this is by layering abstraction tiers on top of each other, each with a progressively higher level responsibility. At the very bottom, we have the XML HTTP request object, which is the API that browsers use to make AJAX calls. On top of that, we build an AJAX abstraction tier to simplify and reduce the code required to make AJAX calls. Example libraries for this would be like jQuery or Axios. On top of that, we build a REST API abstraction tier that's geared specifically towards taking advantage of REST API conventions and helping to address specific API concerns that you are often confronted with as your application evolves. An example library part of this tier would be Backbone. With something in place to help with REST API calls, you can then focus on building your actions. In Lore's case, this tier is represented by configurable blueprints that take advantage of the naturally recurring patterns within action creators in order to reduce the amount of boilerplate code you have to write. And finally, on top of that, we apply some conventions, which gives us a way to auto-configure sensible defaults into the action creator blueprints. And putting all of this together is how Lore is able to convert an empty file into a standard set of action creators. Now granted, while that might explain the concept and give you some idea of the thought process behind Lore's blueprints, it doesn't really explain how this tier works in Lore. But building that explanation up well actually takes a bit of time. So for now, we're going to end this section here, but in a future video we will decompose the stack to demonstrate how it's built, along with the specific problems each tier is designed to solve and which libraries Lore uses to build it from. So looking at the rundown for this section, it's important because action creators compose a large amount of your React application code. And the core challenge is identifying scalable patterns you can build on and that are easy to evolve as your application needs change without having to modify dozens of files. The approach that Lore follows is configurable action blueprints with convention-driven defaults, which means that all the common code is in a single file, which you can then override or modify as you'd like.